Good Saturday morning to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our review of the 2023 Atlantic hurricane season. Yes, we made it to the end. Another hurricane season in the history books, and this year was pretty active to say the least. Obviously, with its differences, obviously, compared to the last few seasons, and we'll go over that in just a moment. But first, I want to say if you're new to the channel, please, I would really encourage if you like, subscribe, and also share with family and friends. Really help get the word out, especially if we're going to build a community for next year as well, so we can have another hurricane season to track and follow together on YouTube next year. So I would really encourage that you do all of that. Without further ado, let's get started, shall we? First of all, taking a look, just a simple map kind of showing what happened throughout this hurricane season 2023. And if you're wondering where you want to get this map, you can already see over here. Just get it from Wikipedia. Just search up in Wikipedia 2023 Atlantic hurricane season, and it'll be like the first option that shows up. And then you click on the page, and this should be one of the first images you get. Basically just plots all the points of the tracks of all the storms this year. And what do we notice? Well, first of all, very active year indeed. We have a lot of plots, a lot of storms that formed this year, 20 named storms to be specific, the fourth highest on record, obviously. So very active year indeed. And notice a lot of deep tropical activity. We did get a lot of stuff to form out of the deep tropics this year. Pretty big change, especially from last year where we had a lot of stuff that really didn't get going in the deep tropics or in the MDR, specifically this area, till either the Caribbean or the subtropics. This year really does seem to be the exact opposite. Obviously, though, you notice we did have a lot of activity here, but also not a lot of activity, typically, especially of the last few years, not a lot of activity in the Western Atlantic, obviously, besides Idalia. This is Idalia right here. We all know that from late August, major hurricane that would hit the Gulf as a Category 3, did strengthen to a Category 4 though. Did cause some damage, but honestly, even that was not as bad as it could have been. But nonetheless, it was a major hurricane landfall on the Florida Big Bend. So that was that. But other than that, really nothing much. A lot of the activity really stayed east of the Western Atlantic and northeast of the Caribbean this year. So obviously that did keep all the damages and the death toll down to a minimal. I did see somebody reply on a tweet that I'm about to show from Philip Klotzbach in just a moment. Somebody commented that we had the third least amount of deaths in a hurricane season since 2000. And especially with all the big seasons we've been getting recently, that is pretty significant. So of course we have this very active season indeed, but not very impactful season. And Philip Klotzbach kind of building on the idea that the season was very active, as he predicted. This is a verification of his forecast that he's released basically since April, and he shows how his predictions were. First of all, starting off in April, didn't verify that well. That's when a lot of people were very uncertain about whether or not El Nino, which was certain that was going to happen, whether or not El Nino would impact the season in terms of would it hinder it, or would we see the warm Atlantic, which I'll show you in a moment. The Atlantic was very warm this year, whether or not that would have an impact in possibly overriding El Nino impacts. So Philip Klotzbach's first prediction was on the lower side, 13.62, but then we go to his July and August predictions, both very high end and a lot closer to what actually happened, with Philip Klotzbach predicting 18.94. That is a pretty close estimate, because we did observe this year, including obviously that one unnamed storm. I'll go over all that in just a moment, but we had a total of 20 nameable tropical storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 majors, and an ACE count of 146, especially compared to what the average is usually for an El Nino year, and even for the average that we typically get in a season as a whole, which is 123. But the average that we tend to see of seasons during El Nino, especially this year. Strong El Nino years, that tends to be much, much lower. And this year we got above the typical seasonal average, let alone the average we get in El Nino. So this year was definitely very active season for an El Nino, and a lot of stuff did occur this year despite the fact we did have an El Nino. So there's that. Philip Klotzbach's forecast did pretty well, especially as we got into the season, and of course things became a little more certain that this year would be active despite El Nino. Let's see the other forecasts, though. A lot of people did put out their forecasts and did honestly see a quite noticeable, I don't want to do that, did honestly see a quite noticeable trend with a lot of people early on very uncertain about whether or not the season will be active, because we had a very warm Atlantic in place even as early as March. The Atlantic was very warm, but of course we had the El Nino, which was seeming like a factor, and usually when we think of El Nino, we think of that as an inhibiting factor into a hurricane season. So a lot of people are very uncertain about that, and you could see it reflected in most of the numbers for the hurricane season. Tropical storm risk on April 6th, only 12 named storms. CSU, we just went over on April 13th, only 13 named storms. The Weather Channel, 15. North Carolina State, 11 to 15. I don't know what this one is. What is this one? Missouri, University of Missouri. Didn't know they did one. That's new. 15 storms. You could generally get the idea, though. And then, of course, sometimes we did have some of these higher end forecasts. For instance, University of Arizona, where there were the one outliers then saying, hey, maybe this year could still be active despite the El Nino because of how warm the Atlantic is. And obviously, that ended up becoming the picture, especially as we headed into the hurricane season. And you can see that reflected very well by the time we got to June. University of Arizona went from 19 to 25 named storms. We didn't get quite there, especially with the hurricane and major hurricane count. We got to 12 hurricanes and 6 majors predicted by the University of Arizona. Didn't quite get that high, but we still did get pretty high with the named storms. Definitely above most of these forecasts. Of course, we had the Weather Channel predict 20. Obviously, with that, they were spot on. But you generally get the idea as we headed more into the season and we got more certain about whether or not the season would be active. We started seeing more confidence that the season would be active, especially with how things were shaping up in the Atlantic. And I guess that goes to show, and it's funny enough, because you notice from last year, we all were expecting a really active season, and the Atlantic was seemingly in a pretty good spot for an active season. We had it warm by the time we got to June, and then we had La Nina as well, and yet that ended up failing. And as opposed to this year, kind of funny that it was almost the opposite situation where everybody was expecting the season would not be that active, or honestly, I'll be honest with that, it was a little more 50-50. Some people were straight off the gate expecting it to be very active, while a lot of others, because of El Nino, they were very reserved, and some very not so into this year, some obviously on the much lower end. But as we got closer towards the season and things became a little more certain, people started going to a much higher end forecast. So it really does show how things can really change, especially with just the course of a few months. And that's something to keep in mind, not only for next season, but for the rest of the seasons to come, for as long as all of us will live. It's always very important to keep in mind that things can really change, especially in the preseason leading up to the season. It's very vulnerable in terms of the factors, and those factors can really change even within just months, 1 or 2 months, they can change. So very important to always keep caution, especially when it comes to seasonal forecasting, especially in the preseason. So just another view of the season. This is a seasonal summary, kind of timeline showing all the storms. We had that unnamed storm, obviously, in January, and then we also had the rest of the season. Did notice we did have a lot of activity this year, but not a lot really in terms of truly intense named storms. We had 7 hurricanes and 3 majors, and That's a lot more, honestly, typical of a year that we have 16 or 15 named storms, but this year we had 20, and we obviously saw that kind of, I guess, bring down the quality of the season a little bit, because usually when you would think of 20 named storms, you would think of maybe 8 or 9 or even 10 hurricanes, but this year we got 7. So maybe if you want to say El Nino did prevail in some sort of way, kind of kept down the quality of the season a little bit, and especially with the steering. We saw a lot of storms really go out to sea, so maybe, no, definitely I would say El Nino was very prevalent in the steering for the season, which is why we got a lot of stuff out to sea, but still an active season indeed, of course, with our last forming named storm as of right now, because something could still form this month in December. It's an off-season month, but that doesn't mean stuff cannot form in the off-season, and that also applies into next year as well. But as of November 30th, nothing formed after late October with Tammy as a C2. So we had that, and then we also had the names. Where's the names? Right here. Names, we used 19 of them. There's a 21 total. So we technically only had 19 storms this year, but with the in terms of named storms, but we did have 20 tropical storms, obviously, because we had that unnamed storm in January. So the total still amounts to 20, even if we only had 19 of those named. So that means we only got to Tammy. We got pretty far down the list, only 2 more names to spare. So definitely a very active season this year. Why not now, though? Let's go ahead and look at some individual storms. Really not too much this year in the way of any notable individual storms, obviously, because we didn't have much of them that were very much worthy of noting. One, because most of them were kind of on the lower end, and obviously other because a lot of them, not really a lot of them, made an impact anywhere of all that significance. But first of all, there were still some notable storms. First of all, being this Hurricane Franklin, if you remember that, late August, kind of formed in the Caribbean, did impact the Dominican Republic, and then did go on to become a Category 4 as it lifted north into the subtropics, did pass also to the west of Bermuda, and it was a pretty photogenic storm for a short period of time before obviously it fell apart, but it was still a major hurricane, Category 4. Probably the only most significant storm that was impactful this season was Idalia, also late August. It was a Category 4, and this only shows up to Category 3. I think the Category 4 peak was kind of in between. But nonetheless, was a major hurricane impact in the Gulf of Mexico late August. This was around August 30th or so when it made landfall here in the Big Bend. Obviously, damages were still notable, obviously, because it was a major landfall, but only amounted to around $2 billion in damage, so really not that significant. This part of Florida, I believe, isn't really that densely populated anyways, not especially compared to last year when we had Ian that came in around Fort Myers. That is a very densely populated area and a lot of property worth there, so the damages were very, very high with Ian, as opposed to Idalia this year, kind of the opposite. So we had Idalia. That was the most significant storm of the season in terms of impacts, but obviously the highest intensity storm this year being Lee, and even that stayed out to sea, became a Category 5 in the MDR. How about that? We haven't had that in a while. We had Lee become a Category 5, and at one time was forecast by the NHC, if you remember, to get up to 180 miles an hour. Pretty aggressive that the NHC went that high, but they did. But obviously Lee didn't last long as a Category 5 after that, then weakened, kind of remained as a Category 2 or 3 up until it got to Bermuda. Then it started to weaken, and then after that became extratropical before hitting Canada. So even Lee, the most significant storm of this season, stayed out to sea, and I think this is only the second or so storm that in modern history books that became a Category 5 that did not impact land as a tropical system. I think the other one being Lorenzo of 2019. So definitely some sort of marking of history still, even though it did not make landfall anywhere as a tropical system. But really quickly, we talked about why the season was that. Of course, that there was a lot of speculation about whether or not the season would be active despite El Nino. Now, I'm going to take a look at why this season was active despite El Nino, because usually, as I talked about before, when we think of El Nino, we think of not as active hurricane seasons, but this year was obviously not the case, and this is why. In that, oh, come on, don't do this to me. In the verification that Philip Klotzbach did post, he posted this shear map, and it's not loading, but I guess I'll zoom in if I can. This shear map, this is of August to October of 2023 of shear in the deep tropics in the Atlantic. And notice where all these blues are. This represents lower shear values, and if you're wondering what wind shear is, that's what we're talking about. That's basically the upper level winds blowing a storm in the vertical levels of the atmosphere, the levels of which we're seeing upward motion. And if we see wind shear, strong wind shear, that blows apart the thunderstorms in a developing tropical system, and therefore strong wind shear is not favorable usually for the development of tropical systems. So we see a bunch of these blue anomalies, aka lower wind shear. That shows that wind shear was very low across the deep tropics, and that is one very unusual characteristic of an El Nino year like this year. But obviously, in a typical active season, that is a very positive factor that does contribute to the season being active. So we had that, plus, and probably a contributing factor to as to why the shear was very low this year is, notice the Atlantic. This is a screenshot, not a screenshot, but this is a snapshot from the NOAA Coral Reef Watch from June 15th of this year, so the early season. And notice, look at the Atlantic, see how warm that was. We had all these blood orange reds shadings across the entire Atlantic, and basically forming this almost horseshoe shape stretching all the way from Greenland down through the Iberian Peninsula and into the eastern Atlantic, basically showing a very, very strong positive, as we call AMO signal, Atlantic multidecadal oscillation, basically meaning the Atlantic is in a warm phase. In the case of this year, a super warm phase, and obviously in most cases this did break. This actually did break a lot of record warm SST records in the eastern Atlantic in June this year. So this year definitely up there is probably one of the warmest Atlantics we've seen on record. So no wonder you would expect why this would possibly override and counteract any impacts that a developing El Nino would have. And even some you could point out too, this cold northern Pacific look off the west coast, not the Iberian Peninsula, that's over here, but off the west coast of the United States. Look at how cold that was, and that is also not typical of what we typically see in El Nino, so you would expect that would contribute to the Atlantic as well. But really quickly, we went over that. So that's all the factors that made 2023 an active year. Let's quickly take a look at how it looks now. Obviously, as with months change, things do change. So Atlantic is not as warm, but it's still very, very warm compared to average. We still have a bunch of this warmth remaining near the Iberian Peninsula and just off the coast of northern Africa. And a lot of early model guidance, there's been a lot of talk within the last recent weeks of early model guidance pointing already towards potentially of another very favorable season for next year. A lot of people talking about how this El Nino out here will kind of die out as part of a natural process with the very warm Atlantic in place to kind of set some sort of ocean current process that kind of leads to a decay of El Nino the next year afterwards. So a lot of people pointing that out, plus model guidance showing that El Nino will decay pretty fast next year, and a lot of models keeping this warmth in place. So kind of throwing a little hint at you towards next year. Whether or not it'll be active, we'll have to see. It's only December, but there's a lot of support for it, and you can already see Atlantic is very warm even into December. Come on, they have the NHC page. Now that's not even working, but I was going to show you the NHC page. Nothing really that significant at all going on, obviously. Last tropical weather bulletin was posted November 30th on Thursday, and obviously there was nothing in it. We are at the end of hurricane season, so obviously nothing would show up. So with that being said, we did wrap up here with how this season was going to play out. What about the future? What are we going to do in the future, obviously, because I'm not going to stop here. I'm going to do stuff throughout the off season, as we like to call it, the in-between periods between hurricane seasons. So roughly from December to May, that's the off season, and that's what we're in now because we're on December 2nd. I will post, and I was going to post this video. I was going to do this video yesterday, but I was busy, so I wasn't able to do it, but I'm doing it today. And so that means tomorrow, instead, we'll start with our weekly off-season discussion videos, but they will be on Saturday, not tomorrow, Sunday. We'll not do them on Sunday, but we'll do them on Saturday. But tomorrow will be Sunday because I posted this video today, which today is Saturday. So we'll do that, and this will continue. I forgot to add it, but this will continue till the last Saturday before May 15th, in which May 15th is the start of the Eastern Pacific hurricane season. And then from there on, I'll post discussion videos as warranted till the next end to the hurricane season, which will be November 30th, 2024. In terms of forecasts, which I do on this channel, we'll have a qualitative outlook and discussion, basically an outlook and discussion for next year, not including any forecasting numbers. That'll be on December 20th on a Wednesday of this month. We'll kind of go over factors to watch for next season, but we'll not really put out any forecasts, hence why the qualitative name is there. And then we'll also do a preliminary. That's when we'll actually put out real numbers like 15, 8, 4, like people typically do. That'll be next year in April 17th, I believe. This is also a Wednesday too. This will be April 17th, 2024. The day one, as you know me, if you've been following me for years, you know I love to do a day one special for the hurricane season. That'll be including, of course, tracking, hurricane trivia, as I like to do, and obviously new forecasts as well. That'll be June 1st, because that is the day one of the Atlantic hurricane season. And then we'll do a final update to my forecast. That'll be right on the first day of the peak of the hurricane season. The peak runs from August to October, so August 1st we'll do that, and that'll also be in a live as well. And I did not include here, but I do want to start doing more coverage on winter storm activity. I live in the Northeast, so we do get an abundance of winter storms usually. Not last year was an exception. We didn't really have much of anything. Last year was actually the least snowiest year in New York. That's where I'm from, New York City. That was the least snowiest year on record we had last year. So last year's an exception, but usually in a normal year we have one or so big winter storm, and obviously other areas further north of me have even more snow. So I'll try to cover that this year more too, kind of branch out a little bit from just the tropics, because there's a lot more weather that. And also by the time we get to April and May and even March, when severe weather comes around, I'll try to do more coverage on severe weather as well. So keep us busy till we get to the next hurricane season, which is from now 6 months away. So that is obviously something to keep in mind. But with that being said, I'm going to wrap it up. Thank you for sticking around this hurricane season, even though I didn't post much. I really, really do hope I'll be able to change that next year and try to post every single month of the season, every single month of the season. I don't think I posted at all this year in July, but I do hope to change that, and hopefully next year we'll have a much more successful year on this channel. And that really starts by you. Once again, like, subscribe, share with family and friends, get the word out, help us build a community so we can have a really good year next year here, hopefully, or at least hopefully. Thanks for being with us though this Saturday. I really have a good Saturday, especially with everything that's going on in the world. Please stay safe, especially as well. Be kind to everybody. Always be respectful to anybody you see. Always very important. Have good morals and enjoy. Have a great rest of your Saturday. I will post tomorrow for our first off-season discussion, and then I'll post again next Saturday. Bye.